Welcome to the AWP 22 Conference and Book Fair in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm Chris Biak, the Secretary of the AWP Board of Directors. Here's a visual description of myself. I'm a white woman with blonde hair, dressed writer, dressy. That's what we've decided we're calling it. I also want to take this opportunity to give you a friendly reminder that AWP is still requiring all participants to wear masks in public spaces such as this event. We are delighted to bring you this event today. Before we introduce our featured presenters, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our premier conference sponsor, Wilkes University Creative Writing. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us keep our conference affordable and accessible. Please join me in thanking to all of our conference sponsors and partners for their support and participation. Now, before we start, I do need to do some brief housekeeping. Please silence your cell phones. Remember, there is no flash photography allowed during the presentation. Respect seats marked as reserved for attendees with accessibility needs. Please give the authors about 15 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table before approaching them to have your book signed. Lastly, we ask that you please be aware of your fellow attendees who may have disabilities and help AWP be more accessible. Specifically, if you see a barrier to accessibility, let us know by calling or texting our accessibility hotline at 215-770-7291. Please also be aware of those with invisible disabilities and do not question someone's use of an accommodation. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Milkweed Presents Landscape and Literary Culture, moderated by Elena Passarello. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, I think you're out there. There are two trucker headlights just shining directly into our faces, so we're just gonna be really confident that there are about 6,000 smiling faces. So excited to hear this conversation between these three writers about writing the natural world and literary culture. I'm Elena Passarello, and it is my great pleasure to moderate this sure-to-be-fabulous conversation. Let's start with some introductions. To my right is Kazim Ali, the author of Northern Light, Power, Land, and the Memory of Water, as well as several volumes of poetry, novels, essay collections, and cross-genre texts. His collections of poetry include Skyward, winner of the Ohioana Book Award in Poetry, and The Far Mosque, winner of Alice James Book's New England, New York Award. He's taught at Oberlin College, Davidson College, St. Mary's College of California, and Naropa University, and is currently a professor of literature and writing at the University of California at San Diego. And to Kazim's right is Aimee Nezhukumatathil, the author of the New York Times bestselling and Barnes & Noble Book of the Year, World of Wonders, in praise of fireflies, whale sharks, and other astonishments, an illustrated essay collection, as well as 4 books of poetry, including most recently Oceanic, winner of the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award. Other awards for Aimee's writing include fellowships and grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and MacDowell. She's professor of English and creative writing in the University of Mississippi's MFA program. And over on the screen, somewhere, we can't see her. Hi, Kerri. Hi, Kerri. Hi. Kerri Dochartaigh, who's the author of Thin Places, A Natural History of Healing and Home. She's written for The Guardian, The Irish Times, the BBC, Winter Papers, and others. She's from the northwest of Ireland, but now lives in Cornwall with her family. And we're all here because these authors have published their most recent books with Milkweed Editions, which is a press based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, one of the nation's leading independent publishers of literary fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. Milkweed's mission is to identify, nurture, and publish transformative literature, books that change the way people see the world and build an engaged community around it. Perhaps we should all begin by offering a taste of these three authors' books. If you could each read just a snippet from your work, and maybe in keeping with the natural world theme of the hour, tell us in a few sentences about the germination seed that started this project. Let's begin with Kazim.
Well, hi everyone. Thank you so much, Elena and Aimee. It's so good to be here with you, and Kerri, and thanks all of you for coming too. I grew up in northern Manitoba in this tiny little town that felt like science fiction whenever I described it to people. I mean, it was like 5 little streets cut in the middle of a clearing in the northern forests of Canada. And I always wanted to, we lived there for only a couple of years when I was really, really young, but it is where I first started going to school and started to learn how to read. And so it felt really significant to me. And I always wanted to write about that experience. And that's how my book started, though things took a turn, of course. So am I to read a little snippet now? OK. So I'm trying to find, this is describing me. I've been like thinking and thinking about that town. I can't get it out of my mind. It was in the middle of a snowstorm. It was the polar vortex. I lived in Ohio. And it was just freezing outside, and it made me remember those northern winters, those brutal northern winters. So I typed the word GenPeg into a search engine, but barely any results returned. The first few stories were just dry technical accounts of the generating station, which was indeed still in operation, but there was no information at all about a town called GenPeg. But then, further down the feed, I happened upon an article from several years earlier entitled Manitoba Hydro Evicted from Northern Dam Station. Evicted? I didn't understand. Didn't Manitoba Hydro own the land? Who was evicting them? I clicked on the news story to read further. The people from Cross Lake, Manitoba, who called themselves the Pimichikamak First Nation, but whom the Canadian government designates as the Cross Lake Band of Indians, under the leadership of their chief, Kathy Merrick, had served Manitoba Hydro with eviction papers. 600 people traveled the 20 kilometers from Cross Lake to take custody of the generating station and adjoining housing complex, chaining shut the doors. Chief Merrick wrote of the 2014 occupation in a letter to the Winnipeg Free Press. And so this is a long quotation from Chief Kathy Merrick. We're just going to bring her words into the room. Manitoba Hydro has been a great benefit to the province as a whole. Hydro employs 6,500 people, provides inexpensive power, and has brought $5.2 billion into the province from exports of clean energy in the past decade. But for us, hydro is a bitter word, and clean energy, clean hydro, is an insult. Our homeland has been ruined, the promises of fair treatment have been ignored, and to add insult to injury, literally, our hydro bills are much higher than the provincial average. Imagine if the once pristine waters in the lake by your cottage became murky and the shoreline continually washed away. Imagine your favorite childhood camping sites eroded right off the map, your industries undercut, your favorite golf course denuded, your ancestors' graves dug up, and your place of worship defiled. Imagine if you had to constantly fight for compensation and mitigation while paying monthly bills to the victimizer. Despite all the damage we suffer, our community collectively pays Hydro about $3.6 million annually in hydro bills. Every bill is a reminder of the indignity done to us. Then, after contributing to our poverty, Hydro disconnects our people when they can't pay. As I came to learn, that town I had grown up on was on unceded treaty land.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, it was great. Aimee, would you like to share some of World of Wonders with us?
Sure. This is still just my second reading, and I don't have my watch is kind of frozen in time from 2020, so I'm still using my cell phone. So a little bit about World of Wonders, the germination, if you will, of this is a collection of 30 illustrated plants and animals that I still am genuinely curious about. By no means am I an expert in them. I am not a scientist. But it was narrowed down from 200 plants and animals, and this came about, the bulk of it came about in 2016, when I was kind of putting my then 6- and 9-year-old boys to bed each night in a very tumultuous kind of time for hearing politics on the news, and they had questions about, Mommy, what does build that wall mean? Or, Mommy, why is that man saying a bad word on TV? Things like that. And I'm sure I didn't give the right answers. I'm sure I did not give elegant responses because I also had those questions too. So what we kind of switched gears on, because I wanted them to end on kind of on a magical kind of note, is that I started talking about plants and animals that I found wondrous. And the root word for wonder is the same as the word for smile. And so we started out with, hey boys, let's talk about the narwhal, or do you remember that pink amphibian called an axolotl? Let's talk about that. And they had a bunch of questions, I had a bunch of questions. So this really was not a book project. This was kind of this was a collection of kind of bedtime stories in some ways. And then eventually it turned into me imagining talking a slight pivot from my children to my best friends, my husband, my parents, that kind of thing. And so I'll be reading, so each chapter here is the title of one of the 30 plants and animals, and it was heartbreaking to cut from 200. But this one is on the corpse flower, and I'm just going to read a section of it. And it's the largest inflorescence of a flower on the planet. When I was single, the corpse flower was a way to clear out the sleaze, the unsavory, the unpleasant, the weeds of the dating world. On a dinner date, when the guy across from me asked something like, so, what are your interests? I'd tell him about these giant flowers with a seriously foul smell and how I tracked them all over the country just as they were about to bloom. Based on his reaction, I could tell immediately if there was going to be a second date or if I'd be ghosting him soon. The corpse flower has the largest inflorescence in the world, with its total height averaging 8 to 10 feet tall. It only grows in the wild in Indonesia, but several botanical gardens in the United States have had much success with growing them indoors. In 1937, the New York Botanical Garden was the first in the country to successfully display one in full bloom. My own first encounter with the corpse flower occurred at the University of Wisconsin's beautiful campus greenhouse in 2001. I remember being so pleased that the line of people waiting to see the flower was larger than the line to buy Dave Matthews tickets that afternoon. It was the heady days of late June, and the greenhouse temperatures were already pushing into the high 80s. But that didn't deter the hundreds who waited for over an hour to get a whiff of that big, memorable smell. Now, this smell is basically what I imagine emanates from the bottom of a used diaper pail left out in the late August sun after someone has emptied a tin of sardines and a bottle of blue cheese salad dressing on top and left it there to sit for about a day or 3. But that smell and that deep, meaty red of the spathe is what attracts insects to pollinate the flower before it goes dormant for several years, folding back up into itself. The spathe, or the skirt of the corpse flower, is the richest red and maroon. From a distance, its frills look like plush velvet, an extravagant upside-down winter ball gown. But this gown isn't velvet at all. Rather, it is waxy to the touch. In its center, the chartreuse spadix rises to the sky at recorded heights of over 12 feet. When the 2 rings of citrus-colored flowers fully bloom and the giant meat skirt of its inflorescence unfolds, the spadix temperature approaches that of a healthy human body, one of the only times this happens in the plant world. And the famous smell, oh, the smell, becomes a fragrant invitation to nocturnal insects like the carrion beetles. Now, some of the names of the corpse flowers cultivated in captivity over the last few years include Morty, Patricia, Wee Stinky, Audrey, Octavia, Rosie, Little Dougie, Tara, 007, Titania, Cronus, the Velvet Queen, Maximus, Chanel, Perry, Little John, Wally, Morticia, and the amazing Stinko. I can't get over the plant's temperature, though. When you touch the spadix of a corpse flower, it feels almost human, full of blood, and you might expect to feel your hand pulse at its heartbeat. Just last week, I read how trees speak to each other underground, how they let out warnings of toxins or deforestation. Trees have also been known to form alliances and friendships and let out warnings of, trees have been known to to form alliances and friendships through fungal networks, and all of these findings are still so new, but I'm in love with the idea that plants have a temperature, that they can run warm and cold when they need to, that they can send signals to species who will help them, not harm them. And what a magnificent telegraph we might send back, especially if other humans have ever made you feel alone on this earth.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I think the line to get into this conversation was longer than the line for Dave Matthews tickets. So we are the corpse flower.
I don't know. It was 2001. That was kind of the height of Dave Matthews mania.
That was a hot time. Okay, and last but not least, we're going to go remote and hear from Kerri. Kerri, are you out there?
I'm here. Thank you for having me. It was beautiful to hear both of you reading. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. So the germination for this book, for Thin Places, happened because of a dream, which sounds really silly, but that's just sometimes how things are. So a number of years ago, I was sleeping over in my van on the southwest coast of Ireland, and it was in February, and my one of the most kind of difficult periods of my childhood was when my father's work van was used in a sort of a, I don't want to wreck it, it's in the book, but it was used in a kind of a political jaunt, and I have dreams about that a lot. But anyway, this night that I slept in the van, I didn't dream about that, and instead I dreamed about a butterfly. And the butterfly looked like it was dead in the dream, and then it wasn't dead. And it sounds really silly, but it really affected me. And then that same weekend, The Guardian published information about species loss, the loss of all these insects, and how drastic the situation is. And somehow those two things combined together, and I began to write about my childhood and about insects, and it somehow grew into this book. But I'm going to read you a small section from a bit in the book that talks about my grandfather's. The book is kind of in memory of him. He taught me about the thin places that the title speaks to, and yeah, it's about goldfinches, and my little son just heard a goldfinch for the first time, just literally before I came on the call with you, so I thought I'd read this section. My grandfather talked about birds, how that once when he was a little boy, he'd stood beneath an oak tree while a small bird flitted between its branches. He talked about how the bird was golden, like the earth on fire, with red flames and wee black bits like coal spat back out onto the hearth. How he jumped up and down in excitement, convinced they were from another place, blown in on the Atlantic winds, from another world than this one. The man he was along with, the next door neighbour of the two sisters who were rearing my grandfather, said, "Goldfinch, lad, wait till you see a charm of them. Quare brings a smile to your face, I'll tell you that." The next time a single bird ever brought such joy to that wee face of his was almost 2 decades later. He was in his early 20s then, he told me, and he'd only just arrived on Canadian shores. fresh off the boat from the port of Derry. His older sister was waiting for him. Zipping about in the air above the port were iridescent birds, the like of which my grandfather had never seen before. He had been held in a big ship by the belly of the sea for weeks, unable to sleep or hold food down properly on the journey from his impoverished homeland to this land of promise, a new place full of the future. The birds flew all around his tired head, twittering and chee-cheeing as though they had come out as his welcome party. He talked about how they looked, so beautiful, midway between a magpie and one of our own migrant birds. They were dark and metallic, with bronze-green upper parts, a violet rump and tail, the latter slightly forked with white underparts, like an oil-slick puddle painted onto a showy wee Canadian bird. It was not, strictly speaking, he told me, a Canadian bird. It was a migrant. The birds he was welcomed onto Canadian soil by were violet-green swallows, who had only just arrived on the same shore themselves. The violet-green swallow is one of the first birds to arrive in Canada in springtime, and is among the first migrant birds to depart in the summer. Those early spring migrants, like my grandfather had done, tend to follow the coastline as they journey. Their name means fast-moving and of the sea, alluding to the sea-green colour of their backs. My grandfather watched them for less than a week before giving in to the soft, still call of his homeland. My great-aunt told me years after about how her younger brother had woken the travel agent up in the middle of the night at his home to make sure he could secure him a place on the first boat heading back to Derry that very morning. Canada was not the place nor the life for him, and he left it quicker than even those wee migrant birds. He never saw a violet-green swallow again for all the decades he lived, but he spoke to me about them right until the week he died. As he prepared to pass over into that unknown place, my grandfather named the birds right outside the window with me as he made ready for the next realm. Everyday garden birds, the same ones he had heard for 9 decades, never more than a few miles from that very bled. There are places where there are no boundaries between people, between things or places or time, in which all that we once knew can still dance right before our eyes. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Kerri. That was lovely. Okay, let's have a chat, shall we?
We shall.
I'm going to start out with a softball question. Uh-oh. And then things are going to get tougher. The first thing that I wanted to hear from all three of you about was spark. Because in your careers, all three of you have written about myriad things, not just the natural world, and you've also written in myriad genres. In what specific ways does writing about the natural world, places, critters, flora, fauna, spark your creativity and curiosity? How does that spark differ from that of other projects that you work on? Maybe, Kerri, would you mind if we started with you?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really interesting question. I think the most interesting I've ever been asked. So thank you. I don't believe that there's anything that isn't part of the natural world. So actually, I view every piece of writing as being about the natural world. I guess, you know, I just write about, I write about being alive. I find being alive unbelievably beautiful. I find it like I'm overwhelmed by the world in which we live on a more than daily basis. And I suppose I view the writing path as being a way to for me to try and to try and bring all of that together and to try and make sense of it in a way. So I suppose if I mean, whatever I write, I come at it from the point of view of wonder. So I mean, at the moment, I'm writing my next book, which is very different from Thin Places, but I suppose, and it's not technically about the natural world, but it's about being alive. And I guess, yeah, we're all just here bustling along together on this incredible planet, and it is wonderful, right? It's just like, yeah, and my writing life is just consistently trying to keep up with the wonder of that world. I don't know if that was the answer you were looking for.
It's a beautiful answer, and we're definitely going to come back to wonder. So put a pin in that. But maybe we could open it up to the corporeal presences here. Is there a discrepancy or a difference in approaching these natural topics versus some of the other topics that you've covered?
Well, if I could hop on to just the comment that Kerri just made about there not being other than the natural world, of course, which is true. That we are currently in a natural landscape right now, but at this minute in this room, but we're in a natural landscape that has been revised by the human presence and had concrete poured on top of it and had a building built on it. But there is still an ecosystem in this room. I mean, the carpet, the bodies, the humans that are here. I mean, so there's all kinds of natural processes that are still happening. And as for me, you know, I think I came to it accidentally. I feel like I have been participating in a lot of conversations like this around writing about the environment, writing about nature, the ecology, and I never, to be frank, I never had any interest about that as a writer in my previous life. I came to it because I was trying to write maybe a more typical, ordinary kind of book, which was a memoir of my childhood and how nice it was to grow up in this forest, and then to discover the truth of what was happening, how the dam had impacted the water and the air and the whole ecosystem there, the food chain, you know, all the memories that I had as a child of fishing. You know, there's no fishing on the Nelson anymore. And so I was led into this whole different relationship and into this community, the Indigenous community, and how to talk to those people and learn their stories and represent them. So it became I had to learn all that stuff really fast on the fly. And I don't know if I was fully successful with any of it, but it really brought that point to me, the natural versus the unnatural. And what is the new natural world on the Nelson, like how it has changed. It's never gonna, there's no pristine 1975 pre-dam to go back to, you know, so.
Nice.
I love that you mentioned that, Kazim, that, you know, you didn't just come out of the womb, right, you know, being concerned about the environment, because I think so many people kind of just assume that, you know, from nature writers or people who write about the environment. And so that's also just super refreshing to hear you say that. You know, it's such a good question. Elena has just the best questions. This is, you know, I've done other events with her, and I always just get electrified from these questions. But I guess one simple thing I would add to that, to both answers that are so terrific, is that for me, writing about the outdoors, you know, we all have to kind of play to our strengths, and there are some, you know, scientists who can scare the bejeebies out of you and make you worry about the environment, and there are some people who can get you filled with righteous anger about what's going on to the environment. I can't really do that very well, and I am aware of that. But what I can do is make metaphors, and I just wanted to take kind of a different approach, and that is to kind of start and end with love, because that's how my involvement with the outdoors is. The outdoors was the one place that my entire family felt safe in, and where nobody asks me that dreaded question, what are you? You know, that kind of thing, that catalpa trees don't ask me that question. And so in talking with my sons about the outdoors, I did not want to scare them because it's already what was going on the news. Politically was also kind of scary for them. Again, they were 6 and 9 years old. But I also, being loving means telling the truth. So I also didn't want to just say, hey, I'm Pippi Longstocking reincarnate. This is all beautiful, you know. So that meant when I was talking about love, I couldn't help but remind myself and then remind others that the reason why I felt so comfortably happy in the outside is because I was made to feel uncomfortable on the inside, in the indoors. And so I guess, yeah, I mean, I just feel like the way I interact with the outdoors, when I become an activist, it always comes from a place of love. There are people who can scare you, people who get you angry, but when I myself actually like march or write letters to my congressman or you know, pick up the phone and call someone, it's because I love the thing that I'm trying to protect. And so I really wanted that to reflect my essays in this collection, so that every single one you can point to and be like, oh, no, I can absolutely see she was talking to her kids at first. This is, or someone that Aimee loves at first, about the outside. This this begins and ends with love.
So it's not nature writing, it's love writing, or in Kerri's interpretation, it's life writing. There's no need to gatekeep. Yeah.
But Aimee, that was so beautiful. But can I just quickly say that it reminds me of that bit in your book where you say that your dad took the time to teach his daughters how to tell the time by the sun. And like, it's just, I didn't know that your book was told to your sons first. And it's so much more touching to know that you're doing that through this book.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny. It's kind of amazing that I became an English professor because we didn't really have literature in our house, ever. It was always science books. And then the learning that I had was, you know, oral. My parents would take us out in the world and teach us the names of plants and trees. And no matter where we moved, we had the vocabulary for the outside. Because I think they didn't have the vocabulary for, you know, the microaggressions or, you know, the racist treatment that they received, but they absolutely had the vocabulary for what was outside. Yeah, thanks, Kerri.
I feel like, too, my family is, I live with a gardener.
Right.
Yeah, my partner of 20 years, Marco Wilkinson, who has written a beautiful book. It's just out about weeds, but also about life.
Wow.
And he, you know, living with him and going on walks and seeing things, and like, you know, I know so much Latin now, plant names and stuff like that. But just that way of seeing the world also that he taught me in the conversations that we've had, like when you talked about, when Kerri talked about your parents teaching you how to tell time by the sun, I thought of conversations that Marco and I have had, and that he's also written about, where like telling time by the forest, like when the rampions come and when things bloom and stuff like that, so that all of the landscape is a clock that you can.
Wow.
And it's cool. He's a deep fellow.
It's a great book. Matter.
Matter. Yeah. So I feel like that did to prepare me in some way to become like this accidental nature writer. You know, although my book is not in that depth of the biology and the intensity of the connection of the metaphor. It's a little different than that.
Well, that makes me think of something Aimee said earlier. By no means am I an expert about the corpse flower or the axolotl. And this is something that resonates with me as somebody who is not a nature writer, who is interested in writing about the natural world. There's no way that I'm ever going to be able to catch up, right? Like, I started going outside when I was 38 years old, and you know, there's only so much time. But that means that you have to approach, you have to come as a person on the page you have to devise some kind of a plan. So I wonder if this is more of an off-the-cuff question, if the three of you, if you feel like you're coming, like Aimee said, from a place of not expertise, What do you end up doing, not necessarily to make up for it, but what do you do to hold that position and to amplify that position? Aimee, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I think I don't make any kind of apologies for it, because I think that's, you know, I said earlier in an earlier talk, I have been kind of a nerd all my life. And I'm so proud to say I'm a lifelong learner. I don't ever want to say, well, that does it. I know all about narwhals, you know, that kind of thing. If that happens, that means I have no pulse. I'm dead, you know. And still now, after this book has been out, there's still new things, new research about narwhals that I wish I could have included in the book. And that was just modeled for me by this love of reading that we all have here in this room. I was the girl, you know, sitting on the floor of the libraries. They'd have to flick the lights off to say, okay, Aimee, not anybody, but like, Aimee, it's time to pick out some books now. And I think that models for us now I'm so grateful for that. My parents didn't do it on purpose or anything like that, but now I see what a great gift that is, because it's a great show of vulnerability and a great show of tenderness. Vulnerability meaning because you have to be able to say, I don't know everything, I don't have all the answers, but further, I would like to seek them. I would like to ask you to teach me. And I love learning. I think we all in this room love learning. We all are lifelong learners. And I think you can see within 5 seconds when you meet somebody and they have noticed they're not curious about the planet, they're not curious about a thing except for themselves. You know, and that's kind of a scary place to be in. Yeah. You know, it's very vulnerable to say, I'm not the expert, and I would also like help in learning. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I think it's just a good practice to have, to stay curious. I think we're all curious as kids. Something happens, though, where it's kind of not cool to keep asking questions, or I don't know, or it's like it's seen as weak somehow in some circles. Not here, not amongst writers, but yeah, I always want, I come to all of my writing with questions, not like, oh, I have something to say, let me just spill it on the page. No, I have so many questions. Yeah. Kazim, how about you?
I mean, I had two learning processes to go through with writing this book. The first and most significant was going back to that community that my family's actions had violated, and to go back in as a, wanting to learn, but understanding what could be taught and what could not be taught, and what had to be experienced. And they made their own demands upon me as somebody going, like, someone returning to the scene of the crime, as it were. Thanks. And we were all both aware in the situation, the people of Cross Lake and me as a brown immigrant, and then them as the indigenous people, and that sort of weird encounter that we had with each other. And so I had to learn how to do it, and then I had to learn everything they had to teach me. So it was a really intense experience, and it's continued past the publication of the book, of course. But the second part then was, whose story was it? And it did start out as my story, but then the second iteration of it was fully the story of the people of Cross Lake and the story of Pimicikamak. And it was actually Daniel Slager, the editor of Milkweed, who said, I don't know, Kazim, I think your part of it, like your family as immigrants going up there, and you now struggling with your responsibilities here, I think that has to be part of it. I don't think you can just write a book about this dam and have it be like more of a reportage kind of journalistic type of piece. And so then I had to rewrite the whole book. So it was written probably 4 different times to get to this. To get to this point. And I was just telling Elena before we started, in the very last iteration when it was done, we had an editor from Canada who was an Indigenous person named Rhonda Cronick from Alberta, one of the First Nations in Alberta. She read the whole book and then gave her whole range of feedback about how to handle it. And she said, the problem here is you haven't included any of the history. and that people maybe know that residential schools existed, but they don't know what happened there. And they may know that the numbered treaties in Canada exist, but they don't know what they really are and what, all of that. So you're going to have to put all that into. And so I spent the whole summer
Lots of learning.
Oh my God, it was like really out of control. And so the book it kept growing and shrinking, as I'm fond of telling people, but the very original iteration of it that Daniel actually accepted at Milkweed was 20,000 words, but the book is about 57,000 words. So you can imagine how much additional material went in there.
Wow. And it sounds like it's this dance between, because the book, the timeline of the book is you making this trip. There.
That's the frame of the story, is me taking the trip. But it was like telescoped in all different directions.
Because we have to go into the history and we have to go back. So, and that voice in the book knows its shit, if I could say that, right? But there's this other voice in the book that's saying, it's in the hotel room doing yoga, saying like, what am I doing here? Like, what's the answer? So there's this like conversation between what the reader told you needed to do in terms of coming correct with the history, and then the generosity maybe that connects to kind of what Aimee was talking about with admitting to your reader and yourself that you are on a journey of unknowing, right? At the same, so we get kind of two levels of, maybe if expertise is the right word.
Yeah, I wanted to track, narratively, I wanted to track my own emerging consciousness as I learned things. And yet, in order to explain the background, I had to know stuff. So there were lots of tricks, like, as I came to learn later, blah, 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 whatever. And then sometimes there's just this narrative, like, background, omniscient voice that interrupts and just kind of gives what the background is. And then you get back to messy, confused Kazim, who's just learning all this stuff for the first time.
This is what I love about nonfiction, and hold on, Kerri, because I'm looping you in just a second. Nonfiction allows for both things to happen, right? Like, it allows for you to have that consciousness sort of move back and forth, and for you to be multiple selves on the page. And I'll be done. My evangelism for nonfiction is ended. Tracking your emerging consciousness, Kazim, that makes me think of Kerri's book, which is this, I saw it, Kerri, as this extreme expertise in an inner life over the course of that life. And I wonder, Kerri, do you have any memory of how you perfected that voice to track that consciousness, to be able to present that on the page?
Ooh,
Sorry.
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I had an answer for your previous question.
Well, then just go back to that one, Kerri. Just go back to that one.
No.
What was the previous question?
So you were both talking about not being experts on things and how you kind of make up for it. But I suppose your point links in there about this kind of inner dialogue. I guess when, like Kazim was saying, when you have all these different iterations of the book, right? And I love that you talked about your editor and how it felt like it was quite important to have their input in how your book kind of opened up or unfurled like a fern or something. I suppose I think that's how all good art kind of works. As soon as we come at it where we think it's like just our story or just our painting or just our whatever, like just the dam being built or whatever, then we're no longer there anymore. We're not in the process of being or that process of wonder or of like asking the questions like Aimee was saying. And I like to I tried to come at everything in thin places from a place of deep listening. So I would question everything, and then I would write a response to that by trying to bring all the people to the table who hadn't been invited in my point of view before. So whether that be like a moth or or whether that be, the people who petrol bombed my house because of political reasons, or whether that be, the person that sort of, began the troubles in Ireland. I just kind of tried to bring it all together and see it as being so beautifully interwoven. Like, I know it sounds weird to talk about trauma or violence as as being able to be on the same page as something like a moth or a bird's nest. But actually, I believe really fully, like we're trying to coexist in a way that is respectful. And I think until we acknowledge things like I try in the book to acknowledge that there is deep sorrow in the world, there is deep suffering. You know, people have lost their land. People where I come from have been forced to leave the land that they were brought up on through poverty and through grief and through trauma. But ultimately, I do believe that the human race in its core is still trying. Like every single day I wake up anew just thinking like, we can do this. We know what it takes. I think we know what it takes to live alongside others in a way that's respectful and mutually accepting. And I think the more and more people who write about that and who think about that and who bring all these other voices together, the more chance we have that everyone gets heard, which ultimately is a way of everyone being welcomed. Because when we listen, we're welcoming someone into our being.
Am I hearing that right? And when you were thinking about building your own consciousness as the voice of the book, as the narrator of the book, as the person who is talking about their interiority, you were always considering other beings as a part of that interiority. Is that right? Yeah,
trying my best to, yeah.
That's great. And something that you said about leaving the land made me think of this question that I had. I was trying to think of things that all three of y'all's books have in common. And one of them, I think, is leaving. I think they involve scenarios of leaving the places of our childhoods, leaving our families, leaving the countries of our origins, leaving the creatures and other natural things that brought us comfort in times of upheaval. Loss, of course, is a kind of leaving as well. So I would really love to hear from the three of you about leaving and the way it intersects with the other big job of your books, which is depicting these natural entities. Did you find those two things kind of bumping up against each other at any part of the process? Maybe Kazim, would you like to start?
Leaving and then arriving again, and that feeling of familiarity, of deep, deep familiarity, when I got back to northern Manitoba and saw that type of landscape. Because since that was the place where I first learned to read and write, I had so many associations. Like when I think of trees, I would think of those tall trees, the fir trees. I don't know what kind they were. And I would be reading, you know, Encyclopedia Brown or something like that, where, you know, Sally Kimball climbs up into a tree. And I would think, like, how would you climb a tree? I mean, there are no branches. They go up like 200 feet with just the trunk. How do you climb that, you know? I didn't know anything about it. And because the town was in the middle of the forest, there were wild animals in the forest, of course, and so it was like that M. Night Shyamalan movie, The Village, where you just had to stay just in there. That's how I grew up, where it was like we couldn't go in. And I remember some kids went into the forest once and these wolverines were chasing them.
Oh my God.
They had to run back into town. So it was just, I mean, it was, when I went back up there, so anyways, then we moved, oh my God, we moved from there to New York City. Bad idea. I mean, the psychological trauma of that for me was like, you know, I grew up in this town of however many people. My school had 80 people in my school. There were, it was grades K through 8, and that was it. And then I went to PS 22 in Staten Island, where there's like a very famous YouTube choir.
Oh yeah, with the guy with the ponytail. Yeah.
That's where I went to elementary school in New York. And so anyways, long story short, when I went back to northern Manitoba, it was like coming back to this familiar place, like, oh yes, this is what I think of landscape. This is what things look like to me. This is what water is. This is what winter feels like. This is what the sky looks like, you know, because there's no light pollution up there. And it was all like my entire childhood, after those early years, my entire childhood was a childhood of loss of that like how I had come to understand what the natural world actually was, in a way, as a child. And that's why I think, Aimee, your book is like so powerful, those moments where it is the sons that are encountering this stuff, because that wonder is so pure, you know, or your child self experiencing it, because then you can do it like in the unfiltered way, which is, I think, one of the powers of your book. And I think that when we were talking about, like, we didn't actually talk about it, but this is a question that could be asked, which is like the relationship between wonder and justice, which is like, okay, looking at the world, finding it beautiful, and then, you know, recognizing all of the ways that it's compromised by our human actions, you know, climate compromise, very precarious world. And I don't think you actually do leave that out in your book. Like, it's there and it's talked about. And one very powerful moment is at the end of the chapter. And I've always wanted to ask you about this, the end of the chapter about the octopus, where there's just a single sentence that after the son has held the octopus in his hands, because they're supposed to eat octopus that night, and he just says he never eats, my son never ate octopus again, or something like that.
Yeah.
So there was a response in terms of like wonder elicited an action in the world, in other words. So,
Yeah, that's so, gosh, all these, you know, I don't think in linear ways, so I have kind of, you know, an explosion of thoughts here. But yeah, just to follow up on what Kazim was saying, that octopus chapter, and my eldest son, he's in 9th grade now, but, you know, from his first, you know, utterances, he's been in love with sea creatures. He was an anglerfish for Halloween as a kindergartner, and that was his choice. Not, and you know, you can't, at the time, you couldn't, now you could buy anglerfish costumes on Etsy and stuff. At the time, I was paper macheing things, you know, to make this happen. And I did it, by golly, I did it. And so, yeah, there's a moment in the book where we were in Greece, the seafood, they joke, is so fresh it's caught that day, you know, and then you have it at night. And he was holding an octopus in his hands, and it died. It died in kind of both of our hands. And my son watched this all happen. And prior to that, he had loved seafood and everything like that. And it died because it was being handled, you know. And so, and I really thought maybe I shouldn't put this chapter in because it was not flattering. You know, I was responsible for I was also holding and kind of juggling this octopus in my hands as well, and it died. And my son does not eat seafood anymore, any seafood, from that exact moment. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I don't have much to say except for the fact that that was a moment. He still loves it so much, but I think just, he hasn't stopped learning about it, but I think just having that experience. I mean, we were in the Aegean Sea, for crying out loud, and holding an octopus. He watched it turn from this dark, rich purple to lavender to white, and that will probably always stay with him for the rest of his life. Yeah, I mean, but I think one of the kind of the moment, I wanted to include that in there because, again, it's not just all sunshine and roses and everything great. Part of this learning and asking that question, this is a writing prompt for everybody, is just to simply answer in poetry or prose, what do you love? And I love octopuses. My son loves octopuses. But how do you write about it from a place of truth and not polishing it up with a filter, you know, that kind of thing? And how do you write about what you love in a vulnerable way as well? So even if it doesn't make you look great, or it doesn't have a happy ending per se, you know, that kind of thing, it's still important to kind of search through that and figure out what's going on. And that was important to me because the last thing I wanted with this collection is to have it be like, oh, everything's fine in this world of climate change and climate disaster, when it's not at all. And yet, I still wanted to end with love. I still wanted to end with not fear and not pointing, you know, a finger at anybody, but just to kind of examine your own choices, and not to change immediately, but just to make you pause and wonder now, yeah.
Was that the prompt you gave yourself working through World of Wonders, was to couple the love and the vulnerability, or the call for change, or the remember? Like, there's a lot of remembering a childhood in which you were put in positions that you didn't need to be put into, in terms of microaggressions or feeling uncomfortable or unsafe. Was that a major prompt that you gave yourself over the course of the book?
Yeah, I mean, again, thinking in how do I want my kids at 6 and 9, now they're 14 and 11 now. They have a very different sensibility in terms of what, how they think of their mom, and they see me as fallible. But it was important for me to show that I was fallible, even to my 6-year-old, who was all too often just, he's a mama's boy, thinking I can do no wrong, and I would have done a disservice had I just presented myself in the most flattering of ways, and my childhood is the most idyllic of childhoods.
Right.
And I want them to see, that no matter what they encounter, no matter what kinds of questions or feeling of lonesomeness that they may have in their future, that their mom did too, that their mom had these moments as well. So, yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of just came down to how do I be honest? In poetry, I always have this veil of persona. It's crafting, who is the speaker here? It's me, but kind of not me. And this was as close to the heartbeat rising to the surface of my skin, as close and as real, as honest as possible. I think if I knew how many people would be reading it, I would maybe not have been. It really gave me strength to know that I could just lay it all bare for my kids and be vulnerable for my kids. And now I actually actively have to kind of remember, it's just going to be 2 people who read. It's just going to be 2 people who read. And that gives me so much power. So I think I still freeze after 5 so books. If I were to think, oh, anybody but my loved ones will read this.
Yeah, more than 2 people have read this book, I'm sorry to say. Kerri, do you ask yourself that question? How can I be honest? How can I transfer what I feel is honest into this public forum?
Like Aimee was saying, I think I was given some advice by another writer that I really admire, who said, when you're writing the first draft of your book, just pretend that no one else is going to read it. Yeah. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to be honest at all. And then for the second draft, pretend that your loved ones are going to read it. And then it's only after, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 drafts that, that the world at large gets to read it, I suppose. But I feel like, Aimee, your points about it. Well, firstly, Kazim, I just wanted to say that before I forget, with Baby Brain, how you spoke about coming back to the landscape, like that was your sense of the natural world, and the trees that you grew up with were a tree for you, moved me like so deeply, really resonated with me, because actually I feel like childhood does that, right? What we're surrounded by when we grow up becomes our truth. Like Ellen is asking, like, how do we stay true? And I suppose we all have this responsibility, not just those of us who are raising children, but I guess we all are raising children, like even those of us who haven't given birth, because the adults around every child, like how they act, like Aimee, what you were saying about why is that man being allowed to be on TV, like speaking that way about other people, and we have to model different behavior for them so that we can show them that the world is this safe, glistening, incredible, extraordinary, safe place. And I feel like as writers, if we can try to make everyone feel safe in our narrative and welcome, then we're doing our bit, right?
How have you found avenues to do that, Kerri, to create safe spaces for the reader inside of your prose? Just
by being open, I think. I think that the more open you are and the more honest, and like as Aimee was saying, even if it doesn't show you in a good way, like in thin places, I lay myself bare. And that wasn't easy by any stretch. And I'm changed in both good and bad ways for having written it. I'll never be who I was before other people read that book. And I suppose it felt important because of the topics that I covered to be that honest, because otherwise the reader might not have felt safe in the traumatic, devastating things that they had to read to get to the end of the book. Loads of people didn't finish reading the book. I mean, so many people contacted me to tell me that they didn't make it to the end of the book. So I suppose in spite of trying, you can't always make people feel safe in a narrative of trauma. But it did feel important for me so that if anyone else had gone through something similar, they could kind of use the book, they could hand it to their loved ones and say, look, this speaks a little to my experience, and it might open something up for other people.
That makes me think about the other thing that all three of your books have in common is that they're colon books. Right? Not that they're books about colons, but that they're books whose titles have colons in them and then additional information
subtitles
on the other side. Having just gone to the Mutter Museum this morning, I have colons on my mind. But Kerri, after the colon in your book, you describe a natural history. You say that this book is a natural history, and it got my brain going, like, how would a natural history be different from a kind of historical writing history? And it sounds like maybe that's part of it, is the revising something like chronology maybe, or revising our sense of thoroughness to be emotionally thorough. Does that resonate with you, Kerri? How a natural history might differ from a book history?
Yeah, I mean, the title was the second bit of the title I wasn't involved in at all. I gave obviously I can't take any credit for it. I think it's really beautiful, but it wasn't my they weren't my words, and I love it. And when I think about it, that natural history, I mean, we know what natural history means. It's like we think of David Attenborough. I mean, other natural historians have always been available. It's not just a white man who kind of goes and explores these places that he's not from. But that sense of us knowing what a natural history is does, for me, just raise so many questions. Like, I think questioning is where we all are at right now. And I think of people like, you know, Laura Savoy or Robin Wall Kimmerer, who show us, who like take us by the hand and lead us to these places of wonder and awe, and show us that, you know, we're coexisting in a way right now that isn't fair and hasn't been respectful for a long time. And I think in my book, I tried to speak a little bit to the human element of suffering and violence, but I'm always trying to look, to look at that place of love that Aimee speaks of, and I guess, like Kazim, you spoke of it a bit when you talked of learning the seasons through your partner, like through your beloved, you know, and that's such a healing thing. It's like I'm watching the world through my young son's eyes now. You know, he sees everything for the first time in that first year of his life, and you know, that's pure magic, right? You know, we all saw things for the first time once, and we forget. You know, like.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and I think we've covered it in little smatterings around the course of the conversation, is, can you teach wonder? We have teachers among us, I know, all three, and maybe that's a great prompt to teach wonder is, can you remember looking at something for the first time?
Yeah.
It just seems like something that I see in your book, Kazim, when you go out and you look at the stars in the place that was once and is no longer Gen Peg, or the sort of multi-generational appreciating nature that's in Aimee's book. Okay, well, we're sort of coming toward the end, and this is another topic that I think we've covered in fits and starts over the course of our conversation, but I can't help but not think that it would be a cool place to end. I read in the New York Times an interview with Aimee where you said, I think we've shown that our country, probably our planet, is ready for a different view of the outdoors. I'd love to hear just a little bit more about this readiness, about this different view. I want to know, I mean, I think I know why we're ready, but maybe we could hear from all three of you about new approaches to writing the natural world that you'd either like to try yourself, you'd like to foster, or that you'd like to see in other folks. Maybe we can start with Aimee and then go around.
Yeah, you know, I think, I mean, really it comes down to, this is 2022, not 1952, you know? So our writing about the outdoors should reflect kind of the world that we want to live in. And I know, just speaking only for myself, we're certainly not the first to write about the outdoors, but I think just recently, publishers and universities and booksellers are finally getting the hint. We've been ready for a new version of the, new stories of the outdoors. And, you know, this is not a knock on Thoreau or Annie Dillard. They taught me how to write about the outdoors. But I also wanted to see people who love differently than I do, who move differently than I do, who have different skin color than I do, different practices of faith than I do in the outdoors. You know, I'm a child of the 80s and the 70s, and I literally, it sounds bonkers to my kids right now because they grew up with Dora the Explorer and, oh, who's that? She's this sweet little African-American veterinarian cartoon.
Doc McStuffins.
Doc McStuffins, yes. Yes, Doc McStuffins. How do you know Doc McStuffins?
She's my BFF, man. Be a doc every afternoon.
Okay, so I didn't have any cartoons like that. The only brunette I saw growing up was Louise Mandrell from the Barbara Mandrell. Do you know what I'm talking about? Elena, you must know. From the Mandrell show, this was a variety show, the Mandrell sisters.
Yep.
And Wonder Woman. That is it. There was no Asian Americans just breathing outside, just breathing, let alone having crushes, let alone liking makeup or pop music, possibly having a family. It was very much the most granola. Nobody had a family. If they did, they abandoned them. And, you know, as Walt Whitman says, I contain multitudes, or do I contain multitudes? Very well, I contain multitudes. And I just, you know, I don't know, I think even my white husband would be the first person to say how limited his view of the outdoors was because he also didn't have literature growing up written by people who were in a wheelchair or written by the LGBTQ community, you know, that kind of thing. So I just think if you are an instructor or any kind of group and you look at your syllabus and it's all kind of one kind of writer, that's a giant yikes. It should be, it should reflect the world that you want to cultivate, I think, is what it comes down to it. Yeah. And I think we're more than ready for that. We're more than ready. I mean, yeah, I don't know, is that Kazim?
Yeah, I love hearing about that, and I love hearing about the different, you know, writers on the syllabus that you would want to include, and the different worldviews that would come in terms of thinking about how to write about this quote-unquote natural world, that strange term, but it was one of the things I learned about from the people in Cross Lake, of course, and before, and doing all the research, is the worldview around the natural world. And so the river was seen primarily as a resource in terms of what it could provide, and not necessarily what it could provide for the people who lived near it, but what could it provide for the people who lived hundreds of kilometers or hundreds of miles away, right. the electricity from the dam. Whereas the local people had a more holistic view of what happens to the rivers, what happens to is what happens to the animals, and what happens to the animals is what happens to the forest, and what happens to the forest is what happens to us. And so there's this sort of like whole thing. So I had this conversation with Jackson Osborne, who is one of the elders in Cross Lake that I meet and talk about in the book, and he was talking about the flow of water through the rivers in Canada as if, like veins in a body, and that water is blood in the body. And he's saying like all of these, you know, diseases and these problems that we're having, and like heart problems and diabetes and all of this stuff, it's all related to the fact that the rivers are dammed, you know? And so some people were like, even in Cross Lake, Jackson he's like a mystical kind of type. And so some people are like, oh, Jackson is, you know, doing his philosophies again, you know? and yet something about that makes a certain kind of sense, you know?
So powerful.
And there was definitely a vibe of like all the tornadoes and the wildfires and the, you know, the like polar vortex getting sucked down into the Great Lakes, which happened, and COVID, when COVID hit the community. There was definitely a vibe of like, this is all of a piece in some way that is like, maybe we don't have the science on it yet, but like all of this stuff is like related to one another. And so I feel like if I had a wish for a new kind of writing about the natural world or how to teach it, it would be that all of those disciplines, history, botany, you know, sociology and anthropology and anthropological study, that all of that could be included in, that a discipline of nature writing or eco writing wouldn't just be, you know, the study of creative writing with craft lessons, but that it would incorporate all of this, all of these things.
You have to talk about the people who have lived on the place, the geology that made the place, the politics that influenced all of that makes a place.
And the water itself, you know, there are researchers who would go and test the water and then write about the water. And so, you know, like, take your creative writing workshop down to the river and, you know, test the metal or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love what you said too, that we could write a nature writing book about this space. We could look at the microbes in the carpet, and we could look at what makes concrete, and we could look at, you know, what are those cute little things that live in your eyelashes? You know, the little cute little bugs. You know, there's what are they called?
Mites?
Mites.
Oh, maybe the mites.
But like that the body as an ecosystem in and of itself.
Yeah, or a convention center which has been made to be kind of antiseptic and don't worry, it's clean, and that it's an ecosystem in itself, right? Like I think that would help with this sort of divorcing that I think is in my heart that I'm trying to unpack. That I think Kerri started us out with this, that being alive is an exercise in being natural. It's an exercise in nature writing. Speaking of Kerri, hey out there, Kerri, what do you think? What's on your wish list for kind of?
I mean, they're the kind of writers that I try to read as much as possible. I mean, there are so many people doing this and have been doing this for, you know, a very long time. I mean, like, I know people who just write about gut flora. I know people who write about hiking when they have their period and the impact that can have. Like, I know an Asian New Zealand writer who is incredible and who just writes in this beautiful way about things like experiences that she's had about racism, but also being a woman in the landscape. And like, I'm drawn to that, like weather systems and, you know, like, you know, Aimee, you and I grew ears inside us. Like, really think about that. Like, the human ear grew.
Now I'm gonna have nightmares.
I know, but like really think about that, right? Like, it grew inside us. I mean, I find like all of that just as intriguing as looking at a really beautiful flower or listening to wren song. And I think I kind of always have, like, and I guess, Aimee, I loved what you said about the octopus story, because actually when I was really young, I had this really horrific habit of taking insects apart and like removing their wings and their feelers and laying it in an order. And actually, weirdly, it sounds really terrible, but I know it came from a place of love. Because I wanted to understand what made this creature so perfect. And I feel that way. I'm not going to take anybody apart anymore. But like, you know, I really feel that way. Like, I really want to know what makes us tick. Like, human beings act in the most bizarre of ways. And we look at wars across nations. We look at, you know, sort of what we take from each other, but actually we give as well. And I feel like we've got more to give right now than what's being taken away. And I believe it really firmly. And yeah.
It's beautiful. I can't think of a better place to end. And I'd like to thank you guys so much for being here and for listening. And thank you so much to our 3 fantastic panelists.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kerri.
That was great.
Thank you.
Bye.